All right. I am here with Anthony Citrolo. He is the founder and managing partner at the NYBB Group. How's it going, Anthony?
Hey, it's going great, Steve. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, I'm super excited to get into some tactical advice here. But before we get into it, let's talk about your background. How did you get
Sure.
into this space?
Sure. Interesting. My background is that of a CPA. I worked for what was then a big eight accounting firm when there were eight of them. Okay. There's not eight of them any longer, but there were eight back then. And I was an entrepreneur and a serial entrepreneur. I had a couple of businesses. And essentially, when I decided to exit those businesses, I couldn't really find anybody capable of helping me to sell those companies. So I ended up doing a lot of it myself. Helped some other friends at that point, and then I started this company, the NYBB Group. But it was about 22 years ago. Um,
Nice.
I really enjoy helping entrepreneurs, especially family and founder-owned companies, understanding what their business is worth and understanding what they're going to do, going forward.
Nice. Very nice. And I think one of the benefits that you have, having dealt with so many different entrepreneurs, is around preparedness, like how to get prepared.
Mhm.
So what I'd like to do is kind of start there and start with some of the basics that you can take for people listening that are operating a business to set up and prepare for
Mhm.
exiting, whether it's a year from now, or how do you kind of approach it and what can you share?
That's a great question. I like to approach it by what the if your exit's going to be by selling your company. I like to approach it by what some of the buyers look for, so that you can kind of look at that. And then there's the human part of it as well. So I think, for instance, when somebody's looking to exit their business, they ask us when should they start, and I really say, really, you should start maybe when you really first either acquire or start the company, because sometimes you never know when an exit's going to happen, when somebody's going to come knocking on your door to say, hey, listen, I'd like to buy your company. So you really have to be, I think, prepared that way. And but it's interesting because when folks come to buy a company, they look at a few different criteria. They look at how profitable you are. They look at if there's any concentration in your customers. They look and see if you are, we call it the man in the van. If you're the person who runs the company and you're doing 14 different, you're working on 14 different areas of expertise where only you know how to do it. And then we also look at the financial end. But the most important thing I tell folks is really what's going on with you. What is your plan going forward?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's a good segue into expectations. So one of the things that I get asked a lot, and I talk to a lot of people about is owners' expectations, like how to bring either your own expectations down to
Sure.
reality, or what are some tactics that you've used there when it comes to an owner that approaches you guys and says, I'm looking to potentially sell,
Hmm.
because I know that there is a back and forth and there's some friction there because people are really, emotionally charged into their business. So what are some things that you've seen there around managing
Okay.
expectations?
Well, people are, first of all, they're emotionally attached to their company. They spend more time there oftentimes than they spend at home. They have probably that as their biggest investment in their life. They probably have the need from the proceeds for that business to be what they would live on and what they would retire with. So when we talk about expectations, the first question I have them is, so what is the company yielding for you right now? And a lot of folks don't even realize, Steve, that they're almost living vicariously through the business,
Hmm.
and that their lifestyle is tied into the income that the business really, you know, provides for them. So we try to determine what that number looks like. And I also think the second big thing is, what are you going to do with yourself if you do exit the business, if you sell it? What's going to happen to you? What's going to happen to you personally? Statistically, they say 75% of folks are not happy with their life after they exit the business.
Hmm. Yeah. Just the sheer purpose and value that you derive from going to something every day and building something, and the type of person that you become as you're building something, and then all of a sudden a quick stop,
Well, think about
really.
it. You're kind of the superstar at your company, right? You're the founder of the company. You make sure the company's rolling. People look to you to ask questions and get answers. So I think that you're really kind of you're in the spotlight. You're almost like the Broadway star of your company, and now all of a sudden the Broadway star of your company is replaced with what? And I think it's really a psychological thing that people have to deal with, assuming they have the financial piece taken care of.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. So one of my favorite topics is timing. And
Hmm.
there's like proactive, reactive exiting. And I'd love to get your take on when the right time to sell is. Obviously, everybody's different, every business is different, but in your experience, when is the right time?
So the right time really is look, it's and I approach it from what we're counseling folks who want to exit. First of all, we tell them, continue running your business like you're not selling it or like you're not exiting it. But the right time is really a personal decision in terms of how long you have become effective or not becoming effective, how much you're really exerting time and effort in the business. You look at the financial results too to see how you're doing. Everyone who's the acquirer wants to buy the business when it's on the upswing, not the downswing. There are so many folks, Steve, who talk to us about, if I sell the company, exit the company, it has so much potential. And I said, it's hard for us to put a value on potential. You may be able to do projections, but potential people typically don't pay for. And I say, look, remember, I go when folks are looking at exiting. I said the buyers typically look at three main facts. They'll look at what your net cash flow is. They're going to look at the risk factors in your business. Those risk factors can be multiple risk factors in the business, whether it's too much dependence on you, as I spoke before, or it's poor financial statements. And the third thing they're going to look for is that they'll look and say, hey, what is the ability to scale that business? So I said, when you have those three boxes checked, then you really are prepared for exiting, or you should be striving toward checking those three boxes in terms of looking at reducing the risk factors, look at getting the net cash flow up, and looking at perhaps a plan and a written plan to show somebody how they can scale the business, how they can get to that next level. I'm not saying take a business that's doing $15 million and say it's going to do 50. I'm saying, how do you get from 15 to 18?
Got it. And how about mistakes? It's my favorite one, my favorite topic. What are some of the like big mistakes that you see regularly?
Right. So I think a couple of big mistakes, right? So firstly, I think people tend to overvalue their company.
Hmm.
They look at it and they hear about multiples that their friends have received. They look at price earnings ratios when you're looking at stock markets. They kind of maybe take advice from the wrong folks. Sometimes their advisors don't necessarily know what the market looks like, so they don't have their hands on the marketplace. And if they are planning to exit at X and the exit is X minus 25 or 30 or 40%, and it becomes a problem, right? I
Mm.
think that's a problem. The second thing is really not planning early enough. And the reason is for a couple of reasons, actually. Number one, because you never know who's going to knock at your door, as I said previously. And the second thing is you don't know what your runway is. You don't know what your runway is in terms of from a health standpoint, from an ability to continue to perform standpoint, from a ability to continue attracting good talent. I think so. I think that those are kind of some of the bigger issues. And the third thing is not looking at their own business critically. They got to look at their business critically and say, hey, listen, what would an outsider look at my business and think about it, and where are the areas that I need to tweak so that I can get to that premium exit?
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned runway, and it reminds me a conversation I had with a friend of mine before I sold a previous company. And it has to do with runway, where I said, like, hey, I'm thinking about selling. And he immediately asked, like, okay, what's your energy level? And I thought it was such a remarkable way of looking at runway, where it kind of captures everything. Like you said, ability to attract talent, just ability to make decisions, ability to just take the pressure. And I always boil it down to energy level now. When I think about doing deals, it's like, how much energy do you
Yeah.
have? How much gas in the tank?
You have the same enthusiasm today as you had when they started the company
Yeah.
or when they first started the company, and people go, well, that would be hard to do. And I said, well, that's the difference between kind of moving, propelling the business upward
Hmm.
and really maximizing the actual exit you're going to have, and maybe staying still
Yeah.
because if I tell people if you're not moving forward, you're definitely moving backwards. There's no
Yeah.
such thing as holding serve, so to speak.
Yeah. So we mentioned multiples a couple different times. Let's talk about that with valuations and
Sure.
negotiating that, because I think that, we've talked about expectations of the owner. That's usually a big mistake of just overvaluing. But when it comes to the negotiation part of a buyer coming to the table, you kind of standing there with the owner, what are some tactics that you've seen work with valuations?
So I think first thing you look at the industry you're in and look at what the standards are in your industry, in terms of from the standpoint of what your revenue is, the standpoint of what your net EBITDA is,
Hmm.
and from the overall size and locality of your company. I think that's important. The second thing is the buyer today is so in tune with recurring revenue that's in a business, that they value recurring revenue and place a higher multiple on recurring revenue. What do I mean by recurring revenue? Sometimes, like you've been in the SaaS business, right? Sometimes it's subscription revenue. But oftentimes, like we'll do a lot of industrial companies, it's recurring revenue from the same customer that you've had for 20 years and hopefully have some contracts with them. So to look at that as a higher multiple business. And then you got to go by the industry, what's kind of hot in the industries. There's a lot of demand for technology businesses, for instance. There's a lot of demands for guys who are in the industrial sector, the guys who are the HVAC guys or the plumbing electrical contractors. There's a lot of demand for those. What there isn't as much demand for, a lot of times, are kind of standalone type construction business or one-time programs. So, for instance, if you're somebody who does a lot of construction, for instance, and once you did the construction, you're not the servicing agent, there's a lot less value placed on a lot of those companies. So you have to see. Sometimes you can position your business where, you can have a service component in the business, where you can have some kind of recurring revenue. You can achieve the highest multiple. I also think um, the consistency of which how your financials look help you with a higher multiple. People want to see consistent financials. They want to see growing numbers. They want to see few radical changes. They want to make sure that they're buying a company that makes some sense. And I think you really lose a lot of money. The folks who have any kind of concentration in their business, concentration of customers is a real big issue. I had a friend who it became a friend, Frank, who owned a small manufacturing company, and it was in New York area. And he said to me, Tony, I have a great company. I've had it for 30 years. And he said, and I have 7 customers that represent 98% of my business. And he says, I've had those customers, Steve, I've had those customers for 30 years. They're in the bag. I even manage their inventory. I said, Frank, that's great. I go, what does your top customer equal? He goes, my top customer is about 27% of my sales. And he thought that was just, he goes, I've had them for 30 years. They're not going anywhere. Well, the buyer didn't think the same thing
Yeah.
because the buyer said, hey, I'm not Frank. So Frank kind of misjudged that, and he ultimately sold the company. The buyer decided that that 27% was too much for them to manage, so we'll carve it out. We're not going to pay you up front for a lot of that.
Yeah.
They did pay him going forward. So it's you got. I think you have to get a third party perspective of what your business looks like. You have to have good advisors. You have to have somebody maybe who comes in and says, "Hey, let's see what your business looks like, and let's see where the areas are that we could tweak." So that we can help you get to the point where you get the highest multiple.
Yeah. That's well said. I like that with the concentration risk, and also like the key man risk as well, where certain people nowadays, I did a recent episode about this, where people build a personal brand online, attach a business to it, and then want to sell it, but their face is like the wrapped around the business. And I think that that's becoming more common with like sort of the influencer businesses online. And I think that the piece that you talked about with concentration risk around customers, similarly, there's these big hurdles that a buyer has to look over, because that 27% could just walk away on day one because they're like, "Oh no, you're not Frank." Like we're done, dealing with anybody that's, new. And I think that it is such a important piece to set up processes that can remove yourself from the business, and that in turn impacts valuation and makes it more of a transferable asset. Because transferability, I think, is sort of this unicorn piece that everybody
Yep.
talks about. And if it's non-transferable, you're going to exit by closing your door and not
And a
being
lot
able
of
to
times
sell.
they don't find out it's non-transferable until they try to transfer it,
Yeah.
right? It's not like something that they predicted ahead of time, and I think that's problematic. And I think the dependence on the owner and the dependence on one person or one person who's a key person to kind of run the entire operation is seriously problematic. And
Hmm.
I also think, what's interesting about some of these companies that have been around for a long time is even though for instance, Frank had his customers for 30 years, all of a sudden, when somebody else is in charge, there's a different type of analysis and microscope that's put on the company by the customers.
Hmm.
The customers are now a little more aware. They're a little less likely to forgive any kind of mistake or fault. And now you have to go to a higher standard than maybe what the previous owner does. And it's something
Hmm.
that it's an intangible that you really could never tell, but it happens oftentimes because you're not the man, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think it's important. I have a client now I've had for about 5 years, and I said to him, I go, look, 5 years ago, your business is not ready to sell. I said, you're the person, you're responsible for 90% of the sales in the business. And you're the project manager on a lot of your projects. And I said, what you need to do over the next 5 years is get somebody who's can replace you as the person who's kind of the figurehead in terms of selling, and also make sure you have a few project managers who can run the project without you. And believe it or not, he's one of the few guys who actually has done that. And we actually have the business now with multiple buyers. And he said, you know what? I can't believe that actually worked. And he's actually he's so much more content because
Hmm.
he doesn't have to get to every one of those customers personally.
Yeah.
And he knows that if he has a day or two where he's ill or where he has grandkids, where he wants to go to his grandson's, kindergarten graduation, he has the ability to extricate himself from the business. It's given him so much more peace of mind that knowing that he could do that. Plus, it's made the business more valuable.
Hmm. And we talked about some financial metrics. We talked about recurring revenue as being a really
Mhm.
good driver that people could do pretty quickly from many businesses to increase their value. Let's talk a little bit about cultural fit. I think that
Mhm.
with businesses, like for example, I like the friend that you had, Frank, with the manufacturing business. Cultural changes, like a buyer coming in, can be pretty dramatic for like a 30-year business. And I guess, what have you seen work in terms of a cultural fit transferability there?
So, look, I think the smart people who are the acquirers today, they they have some expertise and looking at that, and they'll come into a company and they'll say, look, we're not going to really change anything for at least a year because we want to make sure that we can integrate and we can understand what the culture looks like. There's been a lot of issues, and you'll notice even in financial world. So we've done some work with accounting firms, and when you're merging two accounting firms together, there's a tremendously different work ethic. A lot of times, there's a different, um, a different process involved, and what it does really do is it alienates a lot of the folks who you are acquiring, and it's an easy way to kind of lose some key staff. So you
Mm,
have to be really very careful with that. You have to assess what it is, and I think you have to tread lightly if you're the acquirer there, especially if you want to get full value. On the
mhm,
flip side of it, if you're the person who's exiting the business, you want to much make sure that the folks that you have are aligned with the goals of the company, and like whatever your deliverables are. This way, when you're portraying that to the person who's going to acquire the business, they know exactly to a great degree what they're taking over, and they know that those people are aligned with your goals. They um, they they basically have bought into what the company culture is, so that they don't have to go and reassess the entire group and staff that you have. Because let's
mhm.
face it, when you're buying a company today or you're transferring, the talent is so important. It's as important as anything else now because it's so hard to find very good talent.
Yeah, well said. So I want to, before we get to the finale, I want to talk about trends, because right now at the current time in 2025, we have what many are saying are like probably the biggest transfer of wealth ever,
Hmm.
where boomers are passing businesses to their kids or selling. So you have this huge kind of population block
Hmm.
retiring, and there are kids that don't want these businesses. So then they come to you
Yeah.
and they go on the market. What are some trends that you're currently seeing with
Yeah.
this kind of shift that's taking place?
So, statistically, I think this was about 10 years ago. I think it was Price Waterhouse that did a study, and they said 30% or more of businesses would transfer to the next generation. We're looking at that number more like, 13%. You
Yeah.
move the three around, and for a lot of reasons, right? The next generation, everybody's kids or next generation have gone out and found their own path. They've
Hmm.
gotten educated and they don't want to take over mom or dad's business or the founder's business or the existing business. A lot of times, also, if they did take over, the existing owners don't necessarily have that liquidity event. The next generation's not going out and borrowing $20 million a lot of times.
Yeah.
So then they stay involved too long. So we don't see that as that much of an option. We don't see in smaller founder and family owned business, we don't see management taking over that often. When you get to the point we have like more middle market businesses, you may see a more succinct and more capable management team taking over. But our acquirers today are a couple of different groups. Number one, there's still a private equity firms out there who are acquiring and still have cash. They have been a little bit more paused because they're concerned about tariffs and that kind of thing during this period of time. But I think that'll turn around, and so that's one group. If the business is large enough for them, or if it's not large enough for them, and they have an existing platform company, they may add it on. They really are active that way. Second group there are a bunch of folks out there who we call searchers, people who are independent. They have some financial backing. They're looking to be entrepreneurs. They like lower middle market companies. They like family and founder-owned businesses. A lot of them don't have a ton of experience, but they have a lot of backroom expertise and financial expertise. And then the folks who are really buying too are the folks who synergistically like to buy. And if you have a company today, there's only a couple of ways to grow. You could grow organically, internally, hiring sales folks and doing that, or you could grow by acquisition. We
Hmm.
see more of a trend in terms of the growth by acquisition on a fairly regular basis now. And I would say all three of those groups are fairly active. It's just a matter of where you fit. I mean, are you somebody who is a good fit for somebody through acquisition? It's pretty easy to identify who those potential acquirers would be. And we do see the last trend is financing has become a little more difficult to obtain. Banks, even though they claim to have a lot of money to lend, it's hard to get a customer qualified or a buyer qualified for it. So you have to look and see who is going to buy your company and how they're going to fund it.
Yeah. Financing definitely is a
Very
big,
difficult.
big hurdle there. So that takes us to the finale. Knowing what you know now, what would you tell yourself 10 years ago?
Oh gosh. I probably, first of all, our own business, I probably would have scaled it bigger in terms of that and been a little more national. We have a national presence through a group called Cornerstone, but I would do that. And I would have probably spent more time on the exit planning part of the business rather than the transaction part. We've been transactional in nature over the years. We've helped folks want to sell their company. So now we've kind of shifted a little more. We're more on the exit planning side, exit and succession planning side, because we start to realize that the whole exit is really oftentimes it's between people's ears more than it's on their financial statements. So we're dealing more with folks who are saying, "Hey, listen, can I afford to retire? I mean, what am I going to do with myself after I retire or I sell the company? Am I living vicariously through the business? How can I fix that problem?" These are, some of these are not just, you just don't snap your fingers and fix these issues. But for those people who are willing, it's really an exciting time to kind of help them understand what the next stage in their life looks like. Not that we're psychological counselors or anything, but just to help them do that. And I think it helps them do a couple of things. One, helps them be more satisfied with whatever happens with the company. And two, it allows them to plan. It gives them that runway that we talked about to kind of plan and know what life is going to be like afterwards. And ultimately, there's a buyer for every good company. And if people will allow us and allow folks who are in the know to kind of help them understand what their business looks like on the outside, then they're going to have a pretty good exit.
Well said. Well said. Well, those are all the questions I have. Where can people learn more about you and what you're working on?
They can reach me at the Anthony at the NYBBgroup.com. And if you want to call me directly, and my number is 516-346-5272. We assist clients no matter where you are, especially anywhere in the country. And through our Cornerstone Group, we have an international presence as well. So, but there's a market for your company. Just let's just have a chat and see, what your plans are. And we can, I think, help you through that.
Awesome.
Steve.
Awesome. Well, wherever you guys are listening on iTunes or Spotify, the link and email that Anthony mentioned will be in the show notes. But thank you so much for coming on, Anthony.
Steve, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.